Under the harsh white lights of a hospital recovery room, Jacob Reed placed divorce papers on the bed of his wife, minutes after she had delivered their twins. Nurses paused. A doctor glanced away. He spoke clearly, almost proudly explaining he had chosen someone else. Lindsey Butler did not argue. She did not cry. She simply looked at him. Then at the quiet phone beside her, where a single email had just arrived confirming a $60 billion real estate deal in her name. No one in the room noticed. Not yet. If you believe silence can be stronger than revenge, stay with this story until the end. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. And if stories of quiet justice speak to you, consider subscribing. You might recognize more than you expect. The hospital room had already returned to its version of normal by the time the door closed behind Jacob Reed. Machines hummed with clinical indifference. The fluorescent lights above Lindsey Butler cast a pale, unflattering stillness across the room, flattening everything into something quiet, almost unreal. A nurse adjusted the blanket over Lindsey's legs. Another checked the vitals monitor. Neither spoke about what had just happened. In places like this, silence was often the chosen form of professionalism. Lindsey lay back against the raised hospital bed, her body still trembling from the strain of childbirth. The twins, two small breathing certainties, rested in clear bassinets beside her, wrapped tightly in hospital blankets, their faces soft and unknowing. She turned her head slightly, just enough to see them both. She did not reach for them yet. Her eyes moved instead to the phone resting on the narrow table beside her bed. The screen had gone dark again. Minutes earlier, it had carried a message that would have redefined most lives. But Lindsey did not reopen it. Not because it wasn't important, not because she doubted it, but because she already knew. Long before the confirmation email arrived, Lindsey had understood the outcome. The message had simply closed a loop she had been building in silence for nearly 18 months. Across town, in a different kind of building, with polished glass and controlled lighting, a legal team was already moving on her behalf. They had been waiting for that confirmation, too. 3 years earlier, Lindsey Butler had not looked like someone who would one day control a $60 billion real estate transaction. She had looked like someone easy to overlook. At 32, she spoke softly, rarely interrupted, and almost never repeated herself. Her colleagues described her as precise, not ambitious, observant, not aggressive, the kind of professional who listened more than she spoke and remembered more than she revealed. She worked as a senior strategy consultant for a real estate investment firm based in Chicago. Though much of her work existed outside official titles, Lindsey specialized in identifying undervalued assets, properties, portfolios, sometimes entire development zones that others dismissed too quickly. She saw patterns most people didn't bother to look for. Jacob Reed had once admired that about her. In the early years of their marriage, when his own startup was still alive with possibility, Jacob had leaned on Lindsey's insight more than he admitted. He would come home with ideas, expansions, partnerships, aggressive funding strategies, and Lindsey would sit across from him at their kitchen table, quietly mapping out risks he hadn't considered. She never told him what to do. She simply made sure he understood what he was doing. Back then, Jacob called her his advantage. Later, he would begin calling her something else. The shift hadn't happened all at once. It rarely did. After Jacob's company lost its second round of funding, something in him tightened. The failure wasn't public enough to destroy him, but it was private enough to change him. Investors stopped returning calls. Partnerships dissolved quietly. The momentum he had relied on disappeared without explanation. Lindsey noticed the change before he did, not in his words, but in his timing. The way he stayed out later, the way he stopped asking her opinion, the way small frustrations began to carry disproportionate weight. He stopped sitting at the kitchen table. He stopped explaining his plans. Eventually, he stopped including her in them altogether. Chloe Davenport entered the picture gradually. At first, she was just a name mentioned casually, then more frequently. A contact, a potential investor, someone with connections Jacob believed he needed. Lindsey didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. Patterns revealed themselves through repetition. Late-night calls taken in another room. New expenses that didn't align with any shared plan. A shift in tone when Jacob spoke about certain opportunities, less cautious, more performative. Then came the first public appearance, a photo posted online from a charity gala in downtown Chicago. Jacob dressed sharply, standing beside Chloe Davenport, her hand resting lightly on his arm, her expression confident, almost proprietary. Lindsey saw the image the same way she saw everything else. She didn't react. She observed. Chloe Davenport was not difficult to read. She came from money, or at least proximity to it. Her presence in social and investment circles was visible, deliberate, and carefully maintained. She invested in people as much as in projects, attaching herself to trajectories she believed could elevate her position. Jacob, at that point, still looked like a trajectory. The first direct confrontation didn't come from Lindsey. It came from the bank. A notification appeared one afternoon while Lindsey was reviewing a portfolio analysis from home. A declined transaction. Then another. Then a third. She checked the account details. Access restricted. It had been done deliberately. Jacob had removed her authorization from one of their shared financial accounts. Not all of them. Just enough to make a statement. That night, he explained it without apology. "It's temporary," he said, not meeting her eyes. "I need more control over outgoing funds right now." Lindsey nodded once. She didn't argue. But later, when the house was quiet, she opened her laptop and began documenting. Not out of emotion, out of clarity. From that point forward, Lindsey's routine shifted in ways that were almost invisible from the outside. She still attended virtual meetings, still submitted reports, still moved through her professional responsibilities with the same measured efficiency. But in the background, she began building something else. A record. Bank statements were downloaded and archived. Email threads were forwarded to a secure encrypted account. Dates, times, transaction IDs, each piece of information logged without interpretation. She did not label anything as evidence. She simply preserved it. At the same time, her involvement in the large-scale real estate project deepened. Officially, Lindsey remained a consultant. Unofficially, she was coordinating strategic acquisitions across multiple states, working with shell entities, investment arms, and legal teams that operated several layers above public visibility. The deal itself was complex enough to avoid attention. Dozens of properties, multiple jurisdictions, regulatory considerations that required careful navigation. It was the kind of project that did not announce itself until it was already complete. Exactly the kind Lindsey preferred. Jacob, meanwhile, continued moving in the opposite direction. Chloe's presence became less subtle. She began appearing at the house first during the day, then in the evenings. Her belongings arrived in small, incremental shifts. A coat left behind. A bag placed casually near the entryway. Shoes that remained after she was gone. Each item was a declaration. Each one went unchallenged. One evening, Jacob stopped pretending. "She's going to be around more," he said, standing in the living room as if presenting a logistical update. "It's easier for both of us this way." Lindsey looked at him. Not searching, not questioning, just looking. Then she returned her attention to the document in her hands. What Jacob didn't understand was that Lindsey's silence was not absence. It was timing. She was not waiting for him to change. She was waiting for everything to align. And somewhere far beyond the walls of that house, beyond the narrow assumptions Jacob had built around her systems, were already moving quietly precisely toward a conclusion he would not see until it was too late to interpret. Back in the hospital room, Lindsey finally reached for one of the twins. The baby stirred slightly, then settled against her. She adjusted the blanket with careful hands, her movements steady despite the exhaustion. Her phone remained untouched. The message was still there. It would still be there when she chose to read it again. For now, Lindsey focused on what was immediate, what was real, what could not be taken restricted or reassigned. Outside the room, the corridor carried on with its usual rhythm, footsteps, distant conversations, the muted sound of hospital life continuing without pause. Inside, nothing felt rushed. Nothing felt uncertain. Because while Jacob Reed had already made his decision, Lindsey Butler had made hers long before he understood there was a choice. In the weeks that followed, Jacob Reed stopped trying to maintain appearances. At first, there had been a thin layer of discretion calls taken in another room. Vague explanations about meetings, the careful management of timing. But once the financial boundaries had shifted, once he had restricted Lindsey's access and faced no resistance, that restraint dissolved. He no longer saw a need for it. Chloe Davenport became visible in ways that were no longer accidental. Photos appeared more frequently. Dinner's rooftop events curated moments framed under soft lighting and deliberate angles. Jacob's posture changed in those images. There was a new confidence in the way he stood beside her, a confidence that came less from certainty and more from performance. He wanted to be seen. And more importantly, he wanted to be seen as someone who had moved on. Lindsey did not comment on any of it. She did not ask where he had been or who he had been with. She did not question the growing distance, nor did she acknowledge the quiet erasure of her presence from his public life. Instead, she continued observing and recording. Every morning, Lindsey began her day the same way. Before opening her work dashboard, before responding to any emails, she would sit at the small desk in the corner of the living room and review the previous day's activity. Bank notifications, transaction logs, email timestamps. She wasn't searching for a single mistake. She was mapping a pattern. Small inconsistencies began to form a larger structure. Transfers that didn't align with declared expenses. Payments routed through secondary accounts. Subtle overlaps between Jacob's personal spending and business-related claims. Individually, none of it was remarkable. Together, it told a story. Lindsey didn't interpret it yet. She simply continued documenting. One afternoon, while reviewing a set of account movements, Lindsey noticed something that didn't belong. A transfer larger than the others had been executed from one of their shared accounts to an external entity. The name of the receiving account was unfamiliar, but the timestamp coincided with an evening Jacob had claimed to be at a networking event. Lindsey cross-referenced the date. The event existed, but the timeline didn't align. She opened her email archive and searched for any mention of the entity. Nothing. Then she searched again, this time through a different lens. Vendor lists, investment partners, shell entities linked to previous deals. A connection surfaced. Not direct, but close enough. The receiving account traced back to a holding company loosely associated with Chloe Davenport. Lindsey paused for a moment, not out of surprise, but to confirm. Then she saved the record. That evening, Jacob returned home later than usual. He moved through the house with a kind of restless energy, speaking just enough to fill the silence, but not enough to invite conversation. "I've got something big lined up," he said at one point, standing near the kitchen counter scrolling through his phone. "A real opportunity. High level." Lindsey nodded slightly, her attention on the document in front of her. "That's good," she said. Jacob waited as if expecting more. There was none. He shifted his weight, then continued. "Chloe's been helping set it up." She's got connections I didn't have access to before. Lindsey looked up briefly. Then you should make sure everything is clear, she said. Clear, he repeated, almost amused. In writing, Lindsey added. Structure matters. Jacob gave a short laugh. I know how this works. Lindsey returned her gaze to the page. Yes, she said quietly. I know. Over the next few days, the pattern deepened. More transfers, more overlaps, more evidence of blurred boundaries between personal and business finances. Lindsey began organizing the data into categories: unauthorized usage, misrepresentation, potential liability. She didn't label them as accusations. She labeled them as facts. Each entry was time-stamped, sourced, and cross-referenced. Supporting documents were attached where available. Where they weren't, she noted the absence. It wasn't about building a case, not yet. It was about ensuring that when the time came, nothing would need to be reconstructed. Everything would already be in place. Meanwhile, Jacob's confidence continued to expand. He spent less time at home. When he was there, his presence felt temporary, as if the space no longer required his attention. Chloe's belongings were no longer subtle additions. They were integrated. A second set of keys on the counter. A garment bag hanging in the closet. A voice on speakerphone that spoke freely without hesitation, without regard for who might be listening. Lindsey moved through these changes without interruption. She adjusted where necessary. She adapted, but she did not engage. One morning, a courier arrived at the house. A slim envelope marked with a discreet legal insignia. Lindsey accepted it without comment. Inside was a brief note. No greeting, no signature. Just a line of text and an encrypted access code. Phase alignment confirmed. Proceed at your discretion. Lindsey read it once. Then she folded the paper and placed it in a separate folder, one that remained locked both physically and digitally. This was not part of the record she was building against Jacob. This was something else. Something larger. Later that same day, Lindsey joined a secure video call. The screen displayed 3 individuals, each in different locations, each framed by backgrounds that revealed nothing about where they were. No names were spoken. They didn't need to be. Final acquisition timelines are holding, one of them said. Regulatory clearance is expected within the week. Lindsey nodded. And the secondary portfolios, she asked. Consolidated. Ownership structures remain insulated. Good. There was a pause. Once the confirmation is issued, another voice added. Visibility will increase. We'll need to be prepared for inquiries. Lindsey's expression remained unchanged. By then, she said, the structure will be complete. The call ended shortly after. No goodbyes, no summaries. Everything that needed to be said had already been understood. Back in the living room, Lindsey closed her laptop and sat in silence for a moment. The house was quiet, too quiet for the number of changes it had absorbed. She looked around not with attachment, but with clarity. This space, like everything else, was temporary. Not because she would be forced to leave, but because she had already decided when she would. That evening, Jacob didn't come home at all. There was no message, no explanation, only absence. Lindsey noted the time. Then she returned to her records. Another entry, another confirmation, another piece of a structure that was becoming impossible to ignore. What Jacob didn't realize was that visibility worked in more than one direction. While he was becoming more visible, more public, more exposed, Lindsey was becoming less so. Not disappearing, but consolidating. Every step he took outward created space for her to move inward. Deeper into systems he didn't know existed, closer to outcomes he wouldn't recognize until they were already final. Late that night, Lindsey saved the last file for the day and closed her laptop. The room dimmed slightly as the screen went dark. She stood slowly, her movements measured, then walked toward the window. Outside, the city stretched into the distance. Lights layered over structure movement built on patterns most people never stopped to see. Lindsey watched it for a moment. Then she turned away. Because everything she needed to see, she had already been watching for a long time. By the time Chloe Davenport began leaving her belongings in plain sight, the house had already shifted its center of gravity. It no longer responded to presence, it responded to intention. And Lindsey Butler had already withdrawn hers. The first item had been a coat, light beige structured, expensive enough to suggest permanence. It had appeared on the back of a dining chair one afternoon and remained there long after Chloe had left. Jacob hadn't acknowledged it. Lindsey hadn't moved it. By the third day, it no longer looked out of place. By the end of the week, it was joined by others. A leather tote placed near the entryway. A pair of heels aligned neatly beside the shoe rack. A small arrangement of personal items in the guest bathroom, subtle at first, then unmistakable. Each addition followed the same pattern. Arrive quietly, stay without question, integrate without resistance. Chloe was not careless. She was methodical, and she understood the language of territory. Jacob's behavior adapted accordingly. He stopped knocking before entering rooms, stopped announcing plans. Conversations, when they happened, were reduced to logistics, brief functional exchanges that avoided anything resembling depth. "We'll have people over next week," he said one evening, scrolling through his phone as he stood near the kitchen island. Business related. Lindsey looked up from her laptop. "How many?" she asked. "5, maybe 6. She nodded once. "I'll make sure the space is available." Jacob hesitated for a fraction of a second, as if expecting a different response. Then he continued typing. The gathering took place 3 days later. The house filled with voices that didn't belong to it. Men in tailored suits, women with practiced smiles. Conversations layered with terminology meant to signal access, capital flows, development rights, acquisition strategies. Chloe moved through the room with ease. She greeted each guest with familiarity, positioning herself as both host and gatekeeper. Her hand rested lightly on Jacob's arm. When introductions were made, her tone confident, her presence controlled. Lindsey remained in the background, not hidden, but unclaimed. She observed the room the way she observed everything else, without interruption, without assumption. Patterns revealed themselves quickly. Who deferred to whom? Who spoke with authority? Who performed authority? And who understood the difference? At one point, Chloe approached her directly. "You must be Lindsey," she said, her voice warm, in a way that suggested calculation rather than sincerity. Lindsey met her gaze. "Yes," Chloe smiled. "I've heard a lot about you." Lindsey didn't ask what that meant. "I imagine you have," she replied. There was a brief pause. Chloe's smile didn't falter, but something behind it adjusted slightly, almost imperceptibly. "Well," Chloe continued, glancing around the room, "things are evolving quickly. It's important to keep up." Lindsey nodded. "They usually do." Chloe held her gaze for a moment longer, as if testing for resistance. There was none, only stillness. Chloe turned away first. Later that evening, after the guests had left and the house had returned to its quiet state, Jacob found Lindsey in the living room. She was seated at the small desk, reviewing a document under the soft light of a single lamp. "You could have been more engaged tonight," he said, leaning against the doorway. Lindsey didn't look up immediately. With what she asked, with the conversation, the opportunity. She closed the document and lifted her eyes to meet his. "Was I part of it?" she asked. Jacob frowned slightly. "You're part of this house," he said, as if that answered the question. Lindsey considered that. Then she nodded once. I see. Jacob waited, expecting elaboration. There was none. He exhaled quietly, then pushed himself off the doorframe and walked away. What Jacob didn't understand was that Lindsey had already identified the structure behind the conversation he had just participated in. The names mentioned, the entities referenced, the timelines implied. They were not new to her. They were fragments of something she had been working within for months. What appeared to Jacob as opportunity was to Lindsey a delayed intersection, one he had entered without context. The following morning, Lindsey received another message. This one was less abstract. A secure email routed through the same encrypted channel as before, from Ethan Cole. The subject line contained no words, just a timestamp. Inside, a single attachment. Lindsey opened it. A legal document, comprehensive, precise, and structured, with the kind of clarity that only came from long preparation. It outlined ownership layers, holding companies, asset transfers. Each section mapped to a broader framework that, when viewed in isolation, appeared fragmented. But when assembled correctly, formed a complete system. At the center of that system was a name, not prominent, not emphasized, but present in every critical junction. Lindsey Butler. She read through the document once, then again, not searching for errors, confirming alignment. At the bottom of the page, a note, final phase pending, await confirmation. Lindsey closed the file. Then she opened a new one, a separate record, this one labeled differently. Not evidence, not documentation, strategy. That afternoon, Chloe returned. Not as a guest, but as someone who no longer needed to ask permission. She moved through the house with a familiarity that suggested ownership, pausing only to adjust small details, repositioning a vase, opening a window, changing the angle of a chair. Lindsey watched from the hallway. Not with judgment, with recognition. Chloe wasn't just occupying space, she was redefining it. Jacob said I could use the office, Chloe called out, her voice carrying easily through the house. Lindsey stepped into view. It's available, she said. Chloe smiled, already turning away. Perfect. The door to the office closed behind her. Inside, Chloe began making calls. Her voice shifted, more assertive, more precise. She spoke in terms of access and influence, referencing contacts, timelines, expectations. She used language that implied control. But Lindsey, standing just outside the door, understood the difference between language and structure. Chloe was speaking within a system. Lindsey was shaping it. That evening, Jacob returned earlier than usual. He found Lindsey in the kitchen preparing a simple meal. For a moment he hesitated, as if the version of the house he had left that morning no longer matched the one he had come back to. We're close, he said without preamble. To what, Lindsey asked. To something big. The deal Chloe's been working on. It's going to change everything. Lindsey placed the utensils she was holding down on the counter. Then you should be careful, she said. Jacob frowned. About what timing, Lindsey replied. And documentation. Jacob shook his head slightly. You're overthinking it. Lindsey didn't respond. Because she wasn't thinking. She was remembering every detail, every inconsistency, every step that had brought them to this point. Upstairs, the office door opened. Chloe stepped out, her expression, composed, her posture confident. It's moving faster than expected, she said, addressing Jacob directly. We need to be ready to sign when the window opens. Jacob nodded. I will be. Chloe glanced briefly at Lindsey. A quick assessment. Then she smiled. We all will. What neither of them realized was that the window Chloe was referring to had already been defined. The timing had already been set. The documentation had already been secured. And the outcome had already been decided. Not in that house, not in those conversations, but in rooms they had never entered, under names they had never seen, within structures they had never understood. Later that night, Lindsey returned to her desk. She opened the strategy file, added a new entry, then another, each one precise, each one final. Outside, the city continued its quiet movement. Inside, everything had aligned. And for the first time since the pattern began, there was nothing left to wait for, only the moment when everything would become visible. The hospital room had changed in ways that could not be measured by sound or movement. Everything was quieter now. Not because the machines had stopped or the staff had left, but because something final had already been said, and nothing else needed to follow it. Lindsey Butler remained in the bed, propped slightly upright, her posture supported by carefully arranged pillows. The strain of labor had not yet left her body. Every movement required intention. Every breath carried weight. Beside her, the twins slept without awareness of what had unfolded in the room only hours before. Jacob Reed stood near the window, his reflection faint against the glass. He had not left. Not yet. There was a delay in him, a need to remain just long enough to convince himself that what he had done was reasonable. "You'll receive the full documentation within the week," he said, his voice measured, almost procedural. "My lawyer will handle the details." Lindsey did not respond immediately. Her gaze remained on the bassinets, on the small rise and fall of 2 steady breaths. "Temporary arrangements can be discussed later," Jacob continued. "We don't need to decide everything right now." Lindsey turned her head slightly, not toward him, toward the table where her phone rested. The screen was dark again, but she knew what was there. She had seen enough. Earlier that morning, the delivery had been difficult, longer than expected, more complex than anticipated. The medical team had moved with controlled urgency, adjusting protocols, exchanging quiet instructions, maintaining the careful balance between intervention and restraint. Lindsey had remained conscious throughout, not by preference, by necessity. There were moments when the room narrowed, when sound receded and the edges of her vision softened, but she held on to awareness with a kind of deliberate focus that mirrored everything else in her life. She did not panic. She endured. And when the twins were finally delivered minutes apart, both stable, both breathing, the room shifted from tension to relief. It was in that moment, in the narrow space between conclusion and recovery, that Jacob had entered, not with hesitation, with intention. "I think it's better this way," he had said, placing the envelope on the bed beside her. No preamble, no acknowledgement of what she had just gone through. Only conclusion. Lindsey had looked at the envelope, then at him, then back at the envelope. The paper was standard. The print was precise. Legal language arranged into familiar structures: dissolution, division, custody. She did not reach for it immediately. Jacob interpreted that as resistance. "It's already been reviewed," he added. "This isn't impulsive." Lindsey's expression did not change. "I didn't think it was," she said. There had been a brief silence, not uncomfortable, just complete. Jacob shifted slightly, as if recalibrating. "Chloe and we've decided to move forward," he continued. "She's been there for me in ways that matter." Lindsey listened. Not to the words, to the structure behind them. Justification, reframing, distance. She had seen it before, in meetings, in negotiations, in people who needed their decisions to feel inevitable. "I understand," she said. Jacob paused. He had expected something else. Emotion, resistance, a question. Instead, he received acknowledgement. It unsettled him more than opposition would have. The nurse who entered the room shortly after did not comment on the envelope. She moved with practiced efficiency, checking vitals, adjusting monitors, ensuring stability, but her eyes lingered for a moment longer than necessary. Not on Lindsey, on the space between Lindsey and Jacob, where something irreversible had just occurred. Now, hours later, that space remained. Unspoken, unresolved, but no longer uncertain. Jacob turned from the window. "You'll need to sign," he said, gesturing toward the envelope. "Not immediately, but soon." Lindsey nodded once. "I know how it works," she replied. Jacob studied her for a moment. There was something in her tone, something familiar, but displaced. As if the roles they had occupied were no longer aligned. "You're handling this better than I expected," he said. It was not a compliment. It was a miscalculation. Lindsey didn't respond, because there was nothing to correct. He waited a few seconds longer. Then, with a final glance toward the bassinets, he picked up his coat. "I'll be in touch," he said. And then he left. The door closed softly behind him. The room settled, not into silence, into clarity. Lindsey reached for the envelope. Her movements were slow, deliberate, controlled. She opened it, reviewed the first page, then the second, then the third. She did not read every line. She didn't need to. The structure was standard. The intent was clear. She placed the documents back into the envelope, then set it aside. Only then did she reach for her phone. The screen lit up at her touch. The message was still there, unread, unacknowledged. She opened it. Subject, final confirmation. Consolidated acquisition, complete. The body of the email was concise. No embellishment, no explanation. Just confirmation. Multiple portfolios acquired. Regulatory clearance secured. Ownership transferred through designated entities. All structures aligned as previously outlined. At the bottom of the message, a list of names. Legal representatives, investment arms, oversight committees. And within that list, her name. Not highlighted, not emphasized, but present in every critical junction. Lindsey read the message once. Then she locked the phone, not out of disinterest, but because the outcome had already been integrated. The confirmation changed nothing about what she would do next. It only confirmed that everything was now in place. A soft sound came from the bassinets. One of the twins stirred. Lindsey turned her attention immediately. She reached out, adjusting the blanket, her movements instinctive despite the exhaustion. The baby settled. The rhythm of breathing returned to its steady pattern. Lindsey remained there for a moment, watching, anchoring herself in something that did not require analysis, did not require strategy, only presence. Later that evening, a different visitor arrived, not announced, not expected, but anticipated. Ethan Cole stood at the threshold of the room, his presence quiet but unmistakable. He did not step inside immediately. "May I?" he asked. Lindsey nodded. He entered, closing the door behind him with care. For a moment, he said nothing. His eyes moved briefly to the bassinets, then back to Lindsey. "It's done," he said. Lindsey inclined her head slightly. "I know." Ethan studied her expression. "You received the confirmation." "I did." There was a pause. "Do you want to proceed now?" he asked. Lindsey considered the question, not because she needed to decide, but because she understood the weight of the moment it represented. Everything had aligned, every variable accounted for, every document prepared. There was nothing left to wait for. And yet timing was not about readiness. It was about precision. "Not yet," she said. Ethan nodded. He had expected that. "Then we hold," he replied. "For now." He turned to leave, then paused. "Lindsey," he said without looking back, Yes, when you do proceed. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Lindsey understood. She always did. It will be clear, she said. Ethan inclined his head once. Then he left. The room returned to stillness. But it was no longer the stillness of uncertainty. It was the stillness of completion, of a structure fully built, waiting only for the moment when it would reveal itself. Lindsey leaned back against the pillows, closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again. Not to rest, but to remain present. Because while everything beyond that room had already shifted inside it, 2 lives had just begun. And nothing about that would ever be treated as secondary. Jacob Reed did not return to the hospital. By the time Lindsey Butler was discharged, his absence had already settled into something permanent, less like a sudden departure, more like a structure that had been forming long before anyone named it. The nurse who helped Lindsey into the wheelchair moved carefully, adjusting the blanket over her legs, checking the positioning of the twins secured in their carriers. Every movement was deliberate, designed to support a body that had not yet recovered, and a life that had already shifted. "Do you have someone meeting you outside?" the nurse asked. Lindsey paused for a moment, not because she didn't know the answer, but because she understood what the question implied. "Yes," she said. It wasn't untrue. Outside the hospital, the air carried a mild chill. A black sedan waited at the curb engine, idling quietly, its presence understated but precise. The driver stepped out as Lindsey was wheeled through the sliding doors, moving forward with a calm professionalism that suggested preparation rather than improvisation. "Miss Butler," he said, inclining his head slightly. Lindsey nodded in return. The nurse assisted with the transfer, ensuring the twins were secured properly in the vehicle before stepping back. There were no additional questions, no lingering looks. The door closed. And just like that, Lindsey left the place where everything had been made visible and entered the space where everything had already been decided. The apartment was smaller than the house Lindsey had shared with Jacob, not temporary, not provisional, intentional. It sat on a quiet street in a part of the city that did not attract attention. The building itself was modern, but unremarkable. And clean lines controlled access, no excess. Inside the space was arranged with the same clarity Lindsey applied to everything else. Minimal furniture, defined areas, nothing unnecessary. The twins' cribs were positioned near the window, where natural light filtered in during the day. A single chair sat nearby, angled just enough to allow for uninterrupted observation. Lindsey moved through the apartment slowly, relearning her body with each step. Pain was present. Fatigue was constant. But neither interfered with function. She placed the twins in their cribs, adjusted the blankets, then stood there for a moment longer than required. Not because she needed to, but because she chose to. Later that afternoon, Lindsey sat at the small desk positioned near the far wall. Her laptop was already open. The screen displayed a familiar interface, secure, encrypted, segmented into layers that required deliberate navigation. She entered her credentials. Then another set. Then a third. The system responded without delay. Files appeared. Documents aligned. Everything exactly where it was supposed to be. The structure she had been building was no longer in motion. It had reached stability. Holding companies had finalized acquisitions across multiple states, commercial properties, residential developments, land parcels positioned for long-term expansion. Each asset was held through entities designed to obscure direct ownership, creating distance between visibility and control. At the center of that structure remained Lindsey, not publicly, not obviously, but undeniably. She reviewed the latest updates, regulatory confirmations, transfer validations, internal memos from legal teams operating across different jurisdictions, each one marked complete. Each one reinforcing the same conclusion. There was nothing left to secure, only what remained to be executed. A soft sound drew her attention. One of the twins stirred, shifting slightly within the crib. Lindsey stood immediately, crossing the room with measured steps. She lifted the child carefully, supporting the small weight with practiced precision. The movement was slower than before, limited by recovery, but no less intentional. The baby settled against her, breathing steady, warm, real. Lindsey held him there for a moment, her gaze unfocused, not distant, but layered. Because even here, even in this quiet apartment with no witnesses and no interruptions, the larger structure remained present. Not intrusive, integrated. Across the city, Jacob moved into a different kind of space. Chloe Davenport's residence was everything Lindsey's apartment was not. Large, visible, curated. Every room designed to be seen to reflect a certain kind of success that required confirmation from others to exist fully. Jacob adapted quickly. He always did. Clothes shifted, language adjusted. He spoke with more certainty now, his tone shaped by proximity to Chloe's world. Meetings were scheduled more frequently. Calls were taken with greater urgency. The rhythm of his days accelerated, driven by the promise of something just beyond reach. "We're close," he told Chloe one evening, pacing near the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. "I can feel it." Chloe watched him from across the room, her expression composed. "Feeling it isn't enough," she said. "You need to understand the structure." Jacob stopped. "I do understand it." Chloe tilted her head slightly. "Then explain it to me." There was a pause. Not long, but long enough. Jacob began speaking, referencing timelines, investment flows, potential returns. The language was correct, the terminology aligned, but the foundation beneath it was incomplete. Chloe listened, not interrupting, not correcting, just observing. When he finished, she smiled. "It's moving," she said. "That's what matters." Jacob nodded, relieved. He didn't notice what she hadn't said. Back in the apartment, Lindsey opened a different file. This one was not part of the acquisition structure. It belonged to a separate system, a parallel track that had been developing alongside everything else. Documentation, not of assets, of actions, bank records, email threads, audio files, each one cataloged with the same precision she applied to everything else. She reviewed a transaction from 3 weeks prior, cross-referenced it with a communication timestamp, then added a note, not an accusation, a correlation. Her phone buzzed softly on the desk. A new message. From Ethan Cole. She opened it. We're seeing movement on his side, increased activity, potential exposure. Lindsey read the message once, then typed a response. Continue monitoring. No action yet. She paused. Then added, prepare initial notice. Hold until instructed. She sent the message, closed the phone, returned her attention to the file. Time moved differently in the apartment. Not slower, not faster, more defined. Each hour accounted for. Each task completed with intention. Feeding, rest, review, documentation. There was no overlap, no wasted motion, because Lindsey did not separate her roles. She integrated them. That evening, as the light outside shifted from gray to dim, Lindsey stood by the window. The city stretched out before her, its movement constant, its patterns familiar. Somewhere within that structure, Jacob continued moving, unaware of the systems adjusting around him, unaware of the records aligning, unaware of the moment approaching when everything he believed he controlled would be presented back to him, not as accusation, but as fact. Lindsey did not anticipate that moment with emotion. She did not rehearse it. She did not imagine his reaction, because the outcome was not dependent on how he would respond. It had already been defined by what he had done. Behind her, the twins slept. The apartment remained quiet. And for the first time since leaving the hospital, Lindsey allowed herself to sit without reviewing, without documenting, without adjusting. Just for a moment. Not to rest, but to acknowledge. Everything was in place. Everything was aligned. And soon, everything would become visible. Jacob Reed began to speak about the future as if it were already secured. Not cautiously, not in measured projections, but with a certainty that relied more on proximity than understanding. Chloe Davenport encouraged that certainty, not directly, not with overt praise, but through reinforcement, strategic agreement, carefully timed validation, and just enough access to keep Jacob moving forward without asking too many questions. "You're positioned well," she told him one afternoon, as they sat across from each other in her office, a space designed to signal authority without revealing its mechanics. Large windows framed the skyline behind her. A polished desk separated them, though Chloe rarely used it as a barrier. She preferred to sit beside to create the illusion of alignment. "We just need to move at the right moment," she added. Jacob nodded. "I've already started preparing," he said. "I've got capital moving into place." Chloe's expression didn't change, from where Jacob hesitated only briefly. Different accounts. Some personal, some reallocated. Chloe studied him for a moment. "Not judging, assessing. Make sure everything is clean," she said. "It is?" She held his gaze. "Make sure," she repeated. Jacob smiled slightly. "I know what I'm doing." Chloe returned the smile, but she didn't confirm it. What Jacob didn't realize was that the structure he believed he was entering was already defined. The timelines he thought he was influencing had already been set. And the capital he believed he was positioning was being observed. Back in her apartment, Lindsey Butler reviewed the latest updates. The system she had built was no longer evolving. It was stabilizing. Each acquisition had been finalized. Each entity aligned. Each legal framework secured across jurisdictions that did not intersect unless intentionally designed to do so, which they had been. She moved through the files without hesitation, not searching, confirming. A notification appeared in the corner of the screen. "Incoming transaction alert." Lindsey opened it. The account was familiar, a shared account, one that had once been used for household expenses long before its access had been restricted. Now it showed movement. A transfer. Large, uncharacteristic. She opened the details. Destination, an external entity. The name matched one she had already documented. A holding company with indirect ties to Chloe Davenport. Lindsey didn't react. She opened her records, located the previous entries, added the new transaction, timestamp, amount, routing path. Then she cross-referenced it with a second file one that tracked communication patterns. There was alignment. There was always alignment. She reached for her phone, opened a secure channel. To Ethan Cole, new transfer confirmed. Same structure, escalation pattern consistent. The response came quickly. "We're seeing increased frequency. He's consolidating." Lindsey read the message, then typed, "Continue observation. No intervention." She paused, then added, "Flag for inclusion in primary file." She sent the message, closed the phone, returned to her work. Across the city, Jacob stood in front of a group of investors. The room was controlled private, insulated, designed to facilitate conversation without interruption. A long table stretched across the center, its surface reflecting the overhead lighting in clean, uninterrupted lines. Jacob spoke with confidence. He outlined projections, described potential returns, referenced partnerships. Chloe sat at the far end of the table listening, not leading, not correcting, allowing Jacob to occupy the space. He needed to believe it was his. One of the investors leaned forward. "And your position in the acquisition?" he asked. Jacob didn't hesitate. "I'm directly involved in the capital structure," he said. "Early positioning, strategic alignment." The investor nodded slowly. "And the controlling entity?" Jacob paused. "Not visibly, but enough. It's structured through multiple layers," he said. "Designed for flexibility." Chloe watched him, not intervening. The investor leaned back. "Of course," he said. The conversation moved on. But something had shifted. Not enough to stop anything, just enough to be noted. Later that evening, Jacob returned to Chloe's residence. He moved with a kind of restless energy, his movements sharper, his speech more rapid. "They're interested," he said. "We just need to finalize the entry point." Chloe stood near the window, her back partially turned. "And your capital?" she asked. "It's moving," Jacob replied. "I've got liquidity coming in." Chloe turned slightly, from where Jacob exhaled. "Different sources. It's handled." Chloe studied him, then nodded. "Good," she said. But her tone remained neutral, not confirming, not denying. What Jacob didn't see was that Chloe's confidence had begun to adjust. Not dramatically, not enough to be obvious, but enough to create distance. Because while she operated within systems she recognized, when those systems extended beyond her control. And something about this one felt incomplete. Back in the apartment, Lindsey closed one file and opened another. This one contained audio, short recordings, fragments of conversations, not obtained through intrusion, but through access, shared devices, voicemail backups, cloud-synced data that had once been overlooked. She played one, Jacob's voice, confident, assured. "It's already in motion. Once it clears, we're positioned ahead of everyone else." Another voice, Chloe's, measured. "Make sure you're not exposed." Lindsey stopped the recording, saved the file, linked it to the corresponding transaction, then moved on. The twins stirred. One began to cry, soft at first, then more insistent. Lindsey stood immediately, crossed the room, lifted the child with steady hands. Her movements were still careful, still measured by recovery, but no longer uncertain. She held him close, adjusted her posture, waited. The crying softened, then stopped. Lindsey remained there for a moment longer, not because she needed to, but because she understood the value of stillness. Later that night, she returned to the desk, opened the primary file, the one that contained everything, every transaction, every communication, every correlation. She scrolled through it slowly, not reviewing, observing, because the file was no longer incomplete. It had reached a point of saturation, where additional data did not change the structure, only reinforced it. Her phone buzzed again. A new message. "From Ethan Cole. We're ready to initiate when you are." Lindsey read it, then set the phone down. She didn't respond immediately, because readiness was not a matter of completion. It was a matter of timing. Across the city, Jacob stood on a balcony looking out over the skyline. Light stretched in every direction, movement layered over structure, opportunity as he understood it. He smiled slightly. For the first time in months, everything felt aligned. Everything felt within reach. He didn't know that the alignment he felt was not the one he was part of. Back in the apartment, Lindsey closed the file, powered down the laptop, then stood. She walked to the window, looked out at the same city, the same lights, the same patterns. But what she saw was not opportunity. It was structure. And structure, once complete, did not require belief, only execution. Behind her, the twins slept. The room remained quiet. And for the first time since the system had stabilized, Lindsey allowed herself to consider the next step. Not emotionally, not reactively, but precisely. because the moment was approaching, when observation would end and action would begin. The document arrived just after sunrise, not through standard channels, not through email or courier, but through the same encrypted system Lindsey Butler had been using for months, a system that did not notify unless something required immediate attention. She was already awake when it appeared. The twins had settled back into sleep after an early feeding. The apartment was quiet, suspended in that brief interval where time felt held rather than moving. Lindsey sat at the desk, her posture composed despite the fatigue that lingered beneath every movement. She opened her laptop, entered the layered authentication, and waited. The file loaded. No title, no preamble, just content. It was a contract, but not in the conventional sense. There were no bold headers, no summary clauses designed for quick interpretation. Instead, the document unfolded in precise legal language, dense structured, and intentionally uninviting to anyone, without the patience to read it fully. Lindsey did not skim. She read. Every clause, every cross-reference, every embedded condition, because this document was not meant to explain. It was meant to bind. At its core, the agreement defined participation in a high-level real estate investment structure. Layered entities, distributed ownership, conditional returns tied to performance benchmarks and timing windows. On the surface, it appeared to offer opportunity, access to a consolidated portfolio, positioning within a system already in motion. But beneath that surface were constraints, limitations on liquidity, obligations triggered by specific financial behaviors, and most importantly, clauses that redefined control. Not immediately, but inevitably. Lindsey reached the section she had been expecting. It was not labeled as such, but it stood out. A series of conditions tied to capital contributions. If certain thresholds were met, ownership percentages would adjust. If liquidity was introduced through specific channels, control would shift. And if those channels originated from accounts that could not be fully verified, liability would attach, directly, irrevocably. She closed the document, not because she had finished, but because she already understood. This was the entry point, the mechanism, the moment where Jacob Reed would step fully into a structure he did not control and could not exit without consequence. Her phone buzzed. From Ethan, cold draft finalized, awaiting confirmation to release. Lindsey read the message, then typed, "Hold for now. Confirm recipient readiness." She sent it, closed the phone, then reopened the document. This time she moved through it differently, not as a reader, as an architect reviewing a completed design. Everything aligned, every clause connected, every outcome accounted for. There were no gaps, no inconsistencies, only pathways. Across the city, Jacob Reed sat at a glass table in Chloe Davenport's office. The contract lay in front of him, printed, bound, presented as an opportunity. Chloe sat beside him, her posture relaxed, her expression composed. "This is the one I mentioned," she said. "It's already moving. We just need to secure your position." Jacob flipped through the pages, not reading, scanning, looking for confirmation rather than detail. "It's solid?" he asked. Chloe nodded. "The structure is strong. The returns are positioned early." Jacob tapped the edge of the document with his fingers. "How fast do we need to move?" Chloe watched him. "Soon," she said. "The window won't stay open." Jacob leaned back slightly. "I can bring in the capital," he said. "I've already started consolidating." Chloe's eyes held his for a moment longer than necessary. "Make sure it's clean," she said. Jacob smiled. "It is." What Jacob didn't realize was that the contract in front of him was not a proposal. It was a conclusion. Back in the apartment, Lindsey opened a secondary file. This one contained a timeline, not of acquisitions, of actions. Jacob's financial movements over the past 3 weeks. Transfers, withdrawals, reallocations. Each one mapped against the conditions outlined in the contract. The pattern was clear. He was already approaching the threshold, without knowing it. She added a new entry: projected activation within 72 hours of contract execution. Then she paused. Not because she doubted the projection, but because she understood what it meant. Once activated, the structure would not reverse. A soft cry came from the crib. Lindsey stood immediately, crossed the room, lifted the child with careful precision. The baby settled against her shoulder, the rhythm of breathing uneven, at first, then steady. Lindsey held him there, her gaze unfocused but present. Because even now, in this moment of quiet, of simplicity, the larger structure remained. Not intrusive, but waiting. She returned the child to the crib, adjusted the blanket, then went back to the desk. Her phone buzzed again. From Ethan Cole, recipient has requested final review. Anticipating signature. Lindsey read the message, then typed, "Proceed with release." She hesitated for a fraction of a second, not out of uncertainty, but out of precision. Then she added, "Ensure all tracking protocols active." She sent the message, closed the phone. Across the city, Jacob signed the contract. The pen moved quickly, confidently, without hesitation. He didn't read the clauses again, didn't ask for clarification, didn't question the structure, because from where he sat, everything aligned. Everything made sense. Everything felt inevitable. Chloe watched him sign, her expression unchanged, her posture steady. But something in her attention shifted, not outwardly, but internally, because she understood enough to recognize that the structure was larger than either of them. And for the first time, she wasn't certain where she stood within it. Jacob placed the pen down. "It's done," he said. Chloe nodded. "It's done." But her tone carried a different weight. Not confirmation, recognition. Back in the apartment, Lindsey's system updated. Automatically, silently. A new entry appeared in the primary file. Contract executed. Timestamp, verification. Cross-referenced with financial activity. Everything aligned. Lindsey didn't react. She didn't smile, didn't move, because the moment was not about emotion. It was about completion. She opened the primary file, scrolled to the section marked for activation, reviewed the conditions one final time, then closed it. Across the city, Jacob stood by the window, looking out over the skyline. The same view, the same lights, the same sense of expansion. He exhaled slowly, satisfied, certain. He didn't know that the signature he had just placed was not the beginning of something new. It was the point where everything he had set in motion became irreversible. Back in the apartment, Lindsey stood, walked to the window, looked out at the city, not searching, not anticipating, just observing. Because the system had moved beyond preparation, beyond alignment, beyond intention. Now it was active. And from this point forward, everything that followed would not need to be forced, only allowed. Behind her, the twins slept. The room remained quiet. But the silence had changed. It was no longer waiting. It was moving. The announcement did not arrive with spectacle yet. It carried the kind of weight that quietly altered entire markets. It began as a press release issued through a consortium that most people had never heard of, its language carefully constructed to avoid attention while still fulfilling regulatory disclosure requirements. The statement outlined the consolidation of multiple real estate portfolios across several major U.S. cities, referencing strategic alignment, long-term infrastructure planning, and cross-sector integration. To the casual reader, It was another large deal among many significant, but not extraordinary. However, to those who understood the layers beneath such transactions, the announcement carried implications that extended far beyond its measured tone. Within hours, industry publications began to circulate summaries. Analysts discussed the scope, noting the unusual coordination across jurisdictions and the efficiency with which regulatory clearance had been secured. Financial networks mentioned the deal in passing segments, their commentary restrained but attentive. The scale alone, $60 billion in aggregated assets, was enough to demand recognition, even if the structure behind it remained intentionally opaque. Jacob Reed encountered the news not through formal channels, but through a forwarded link sent by one of the investors he had recently met. The message contained no explanation, only a brief line of text. "Is this the same structure you're entering?" Jacob opened the link while standing in Chloe Davenport's living room, the morning light reflecting across the glass surfaces that defined the space. He read the headline once, then again, his eyes moving more slowly through the body of the article as certain details began to align with what he believed he understood. The terminology matched. The timelines overlapped. The entities referenced, though unnamed in the article, carried patterns that felt familiar. He scrolled further down. There, embedded within a paragraph describing the coordination of legal frameworks, was a list of affiliated advisors and strategic leads. Most of the names were unfamiliar, either because they operated behind layers of corporate structure or because they were not meant to be publicly recognized. However, one name appeared more than once, repeated across different segments of the framework, positioned not at the forefront, but at critical points of intersection. Lindsey Butler. Jacob stopped scrolling. For a moment, he remained completely still, his mind attempting to reconcile the information in front of him with the version of reality he had been constructing. The name did not appear prominently. It was not highlighted or emphasized. Yet its repetition suggested something more than coincidence. Jacob felt a subtle tightening in his chest, not yet fear, but the early stages of recognition without context. Behind him, Chloe moved quietly across the room, her attention drawn by the shift in his posture. "What is it?" she asked, her tone controlled. Jacob turned slightly, holding out the phone. "Have you seen this?" he said. Chloe took the device, her eyes scanning the article with a practiced efficiency that allowed her to extract meaning without appearing to search for it. Her expression did not change immediately, but the pause between lines extended just enough to indicate that something within the text had disrupted her expectations. "Yes," she said after a moment. "It was released this morning." Jacob watched her closely. "You knew about this?" Chloe returned the phone. "I knew something was moving at that scale," she replied. "Not the specifics?" Jacob looked back at the screen, his gaze returning to the name. "It mentions Lindsey," he said. Chloe did not respond immediately. Instead, she walked toward the window, her reflection faint against the glass. "Names appear in documents for many reasons," she said, her tone even. "That doesn't mean control." Jacob considered that, though the explanation did not fully settle the unease that had begun to take shape. "She's a consultant," he said, more to himself than to Chloe. "She worked on projects like this." Chloe turned slightly. "Then it makes sense that her name would appear," she said. The logic was clean, too clean. Jacob nodded, though his attention remained divided between the explanation offered and the pattern he could not ignore. He placed the phone down on the table, attempting to return his focus to the immediate task at hand. "We're still positioned," he said. "Our entry is already secured." Chloe observed him for a moment before responding. "Yes," she said. "We are positioned," but her tone carried a different weight now, one that suggested awareness rather than confidence. Across the city, Lindsey Butler read the same announcement under very different conditions. She did not encounter it through forwarded messages or casual inquiry. Instead, it appeared within her system as part of a scheduled update integrated seamlessly into the network of confirmations and validations that had been building toward this point. She opened the document, her eyes moving steadily through the language she already knew by structure rather than by content. There were no surprises within the text, no unexpected variables or deviations from what had been planned. Every element aligned with the projections she had reviewed. Every reference matched the framework she had helped construct. When she reached her own name, she did not pause, not because it lacked significance, but because its placement was exactly where it needed to be. Not central, not visible to those who looked for control in obvious places, but essential at every point where the system required continuity. She closed the document and moved to the next file, which contained internal communications from the legal teams coordinating the final phase of visibility. These messages were more direct, less constrained by the need for public interpretation. They referenced timing exposure and the anticipated responses from external parties, who would begin to recognize the implications of the deal. One message marked with a higher level of priority outlined a specific point of interest. Subject engagement confirmed. Initial awareness detected. Monitoring for response. Lindsey read the line once, understanding immediately who the subject referred to: Jacob. His awareness was not unexpected. In fact, it had been accounted for. What mattered now was not that he had seen the information, but how he would interpret it, and how that interpretation would influence his next actions. She opened her primary file and added a new entry linking the public announcement to the internal observation. The system updated automatically, integrating the new data into the broader structure of the case she had been building. There was no urgency in her movements, no acceleration, because the process no longer required adjustment. It required observation. Back in Chloe's residence, Jacob found himself returning to the article more than once, each reading revealing new connections he had not initially considered. The language, which had seemed distant at first, began to align more closely with the contract he had signed only days earlier. Certain phrases echoed the terminology used in the document. Certain structural references mirrored the framework he had been told he was entering. The realization did not arrive all at once. It developed gradually, building through repetition rather than revelation. At one point, he turned to Chloe again. "This is connected," he said. Chloe met his gaze. "Most large deals are," she replied. Jacob shook his head slightly. "No, I mean directly. The structure, it's the same." Chloe considered him for a moment before responding. "If it is," she said, "then we're in the right place." Her answer did not dismiss his concern. It redirected it. Jacob nodded, though the certainty he had expressed earlier no longer felt as stable as it had before. He moved toward the window, looking out over the city as if the physical distance might provide clarity. The skyline remained unchanged, its patterns consistent, its movement uninterrupted. Yet, something within his perception of it had shifted, as though the structures he had once viewed as fixed were now part of a system he did not fully understand. In her apartment, Lindsey stood by a similar window, observing the same city under a different framework of awareness. She did not revisit the announcement. She did not re-examine the data. Instead, she allowed the system to continue its process, confident in the integrity of the structure she had built. Because the moment of visibility had arrived. And with it, the transition from preparation to consequence. Everything that followed would not require intervention. Only confirmation, and Lindsey Butler had already ensured that every confirmation would lead in the same direction, toward a conclusion that had been defined long before Jacob Reed understood that he had ever been part of it. Jacob Reed did not sleep well that night, though he would not have described it that way if asked. He would have said he was thinking that there were too many moving parts, that the pace of events demanded attention. In reality, what unsettled him was not activity, but recognition. The quiet awareness that something within the structure he had entered did not fully belong to him. The article remained open on his phone long after Chloe had gone to bed. He read it again, slower this time, tracing each line, as if repetition might clarify what intuition had already begun to suggest. The references to layered ownership, to coordinated acquisition across jurisdictions, to legal frameworks designed to obscure direct control, none of it was unfamiliar. He had heard similar language in the meetings he had recently attended. He had used some of those phrases himself, but the difference lay in understanding. He had spoken the language. He had not built the system. And somewhere within that system, Lindsey Butler's name appeared not as decoration, not as peripheral acknowledgement, but as a point of continuity. Jacob closed his eyes for a moment, pressing his thumb lightly against the screen until it went dark. He placed the phone on the table beside him and leaned back, staring at the ceiling as if the answer might exist in stillness. It did not, because the answer had never required discovery, only acceptance. The following morning, Jacob initiated contact. He did not call Lindsey directly. That would have required a level of vulnerability he was not prepared to display. Instead, he sent a message brief, controlled, framed as practical rather than personal. "We need to talk. There are things we should clarify." He read the message once before sending it, ensuring that nothing in its tone suggested uncertainty. Then he placed the phone down and waited, his attention divided between the expectation of response and the need to maintain the composure he had constructed around himself. The response did not come immediately, nor did it come from Lindsey. Instead, an unfamiliar number appeared on his screen less than an hour later. Jacob hesitated for a moment before answering. "Jacob Reed," he said. "Mr. Reed," a calm voice replied. "This is Ethan Cole, representing Miss Butler." Jacob straightened slightly, his posture adjusting instinctively. "I sent Lindsey a message," he said. "I am aware," Ethan replied. "She has asked that all communication be directed through legal counsel at this stage." There was no hostility in the tone, no accusation, only structure. Jacob exhaled quietly. "I just want to understand what's happening," he said. "There are some developments that involve both of us." Ethan paused briefly, not because he needed time to respond, but because the structure of his response required precision. "Any matters that involve both parties will be addressed through formal channels," he said. "You will receive documentation outlining relevant information in due course." Jacob felt a tightening in his chest, sharper now, more defined. "Is this about the deal?" he asked. There was another pause. "Then you will receive documentation," Ethan repeated. The call ended shortly after. No conclusion, no clarification. Only confirmation that the terms of engagement had changed. Jacob remained standing in the middle of the room for several seconds after the call ended. The silence that followed, feeling heavier than before. He looked down at the phone in his hand, as if expecting it to provide something more than the conversation had offered. It did not. He turned toward the window, the city stretching out before him, in the same pattern he had seen countless times. Yet, now it seemed less stable, less predictable. The structures remained in place, but his understanding of them had begun to shift. Behind him, Chloe entered the room. "You spoke to her?" she asked. Her lawyer, Jacob, replied. Chloe nodded, her expression unreadable. "And they said everything goes through legal now." Chloe walked further into the room, her movements measured. "That's not unusual," she said, "given the circumstances." Jacob turned to face her. "This isn't just about the divorce," he said. "Her name is in the deal, the one we're in." Chloe met his gaze, her posture steady. "Yes," she said, "I saw that." Jacob searched her expression for something confirmation denial, anything that would anchor his growing uncertainty. "You didn't think that was important?" he asked. Chloe tilted her head slightly. "I think it's relevant," she said. "But relevance doesn't equal control," and Jacob frowned. "Then what does?" Chloe held his gaze for a moment longer than necessary. "Structure," she said, "and understanding it." The words settled between them not as explanation, but as boundary. Jacob looked away first. Later that day, the first formal notice arrived. It came through certified delivery, its presentation unmistakably legal in both form and tone. The envelope was thick, the content structured, the language precise. Jacob opened it at the kitchen counter, his movements slower than usual, his attention fully engaged. The document began with a summary. Not emotional, not accusatory, factual. It outlined financial activity across multiple accounts, referencing specific transactions, dates, and amounts. Each entry was supported by documentation, bank records, transfer confirmations, internal communications. Jacob read through the first page, then the second, his eyes moving more deliberately as the pattern began to emerge. Unauthorized transfers, misrepresentation of funds, potential violations tied to shared financial obligations. Each point was presented without interpretation, only correlation. At the bottom of the page, a statement, further documentation to be provided under formal review. Jacob set the paper down, his hand remaining on the edge of the counter as if to steady himself. This is preliminary, he said, more to himself than to Chloe, who had been watching from across the room. Chloe approached slowly, her gaze moving over the document without touching it. "It's a notice," she said, "not a conclusion." Jacob nodded, though the distinction did little to ease the pressure building beneath his composure. "They're building something," he said. Chloe did not respond immediately. Instead, she looked at him. Really looked at him, for the first time since the article had appeared. "Yes," she said finally, "they are." Across the city, Lindsey reviewed the same document under very different conditions. For her, it was not a development. It was a step. She opened the file, confirming that the notice had been delivered and acknowledged. The system updated automatically, integrating the confirmation into the broader timeline she had established. There was no urgency in her movements, no shift in pace, because everything was proceeding exactly as intended. She moved to the next file, reviewing the documentation that would follow. Each piece of evidence had been prepared in advance, structured to align with the legal framework that would soon bring it into focus. There were no gaps, no missing elements, only sequence. In the quiet of her apartment, the twins slept, their presence anchoring the space in a way that required no interpretation. Lindsey stood by the window, her gaze resting on the city beyond, not searching for anything, not anticipating reaction. Because reaction was no longer relevant. What mattered now was process. And process, once initiated under the right conditions, did not require force. Only time. Back in Chloe's residence, Jacob remained at the counter, the document still in front of him, its contents beginning to settle into something more than information. It was not yet consequence, but it was no longer abstract. He looked up at Chloe. "This doesn't change anything," he said, though the certainty in his voice had thinned. Chloe held his gaze. "It changes how things move," she replied. Jacob nodded slowly. "Yes," he said, "it does." He looked back down at the document, his mind already attempting to reorganize, to adjust to maintain the structure he believed he still controlled. What he did not yet understand was that the structure had already moved beyond him, and everything that followed would not be shaped by what he intended, but by what had already been set in motion. The conference room was designed to feel neutral. No windows, no identifiable features. Just a long table, controlled lighting, and a quiet that discouraged distraction. It was the kind of space where conversations were meant to stay contained, where outcomes were defined not by emotion, but by structure. Jacob Reed arrived 10 minutes early, not out of discipline, out of necessity. He had not slept much the night before, and whatever remained of his confidence had begun to reorganize itself into something more cautious, more deliberate. The document he had received the previous day sat in front of him, its contents no longer abstract, but not yet fully understood. Across from him, two individuals reviewed a separate set of files. One of them, a woman in her early 40s with a composed, almost expressionless demeanor, closed her folder as Jacob entered. The other, a man slightly older, continued reading for a few seconds longer before looking up. "Mr. Reed," the woman said, her tone even. "Thank you for coming." Jacob nodded, taking a seat. "I'd like to understand what this is about," he said, placing his hand lightly on the document in front of him. The man across from him leaned forward slightly. "You've received the initial notice," he said. "Today's meeting is to clarify the scope of what has been identified so far." Jacob exhaled slowly. "So this is an investigation?" The woman shook her head once. "No," she said. "This is a presentation of documented activity." The distinction was subtle, but precise. Jacob nodded, though the difference did not immediately register as meaningful. "Then let's proceed," he said. The presentation began without introduction. A screen at the far end of the room illuminated, displaying a timeline. Clean, linear, unembellished. Dates marked specific points, each connected to a transaction, a communication, or a decision. The man stood moving to the side of the screen. "Over the past 6 weeks," he began, "we have observed a series of financial movements across accounts associated with you, Mr. Reed." Jacob's attention fixed on the timeline. The first entry appeared. A transfer. Amount, date, destination. He recognized it immediately. "That was a reallocation," he said. "It's not unusual." The man nodded. "We're not suggesting it is," he replied. "We are establishing sequence." The next entry appeared. Another transfer, then another. Each one linked, each one building on the previous. Jacob shifted slightly in his seat. "These are all within my control," he said. "There's nothing irregular about moving funds." The woman across from him spoke for the first time since the presentation began. "Control is not the point," she said. "Alignment is." Jacob frowned. Alignment with what? The man advanced the slide. The timeline expanded. New data points appeared, email timestamps, call records, internal communications that had been cross-referenced with the financial activity. Jacob's eyes moved across the screen, his posture tightening as recognition began to replace dismissal. "These are private communications," he said. "They are documented communications," the man replied. The distinction once again was intentional. The presentation continued. Each segment introduced a new layer, not accusations, correlations. The woman opened her folder and slid a document across the table. "Please review page 3, she said. Jacob picked it up, his movements slower now. The page outlined a specific transaction, one he had initiated under the assumption that it fell within acceptable parameters. But here, it was framed differently. The language did not accuse. It connected. The transfer was linked to a shared account. The shared account was tied to joint financial obligations. The use of those funds redirected without disclosure created a condition, not immediately actionable, but cumulative. Jacob looked up. "This is being taken out of context," he said. The woman met his gaze. "There is no context being applied," she said. "Only sequence." Jacob leaned back slightly, his mind attempting to reorganize the information. "These are isolated actions," he said. "They don't form a pattern." The man advanced the slide again. The screen updated. A visual representation replaced the timeline nodes connected by lines, each point representing a transaction or communication. Individually, they were simple. Together, they formed a structure. Jacob stared at it, not fully understanding, but no longer dismissing. At the center of the structure, a single node appeared. Highlighted, not enlarged, just positioned differently. The man gestured toward it. "This is the convergence point," he said. Jacob leaned forward. What does that mean? It means, the man replied, that multiple independent actions have led to a shared condition. Jacob's eyes moved between the notes. What condition? The woman answered. Exposure, she said. The word settled into the room with more weight than anything that had been said before. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was precise. Jacob remained silent for a moment. Then, what exactly am I exposed to? The man stepped back from the screen. That will be outlined in the next phase of documentation, he said. Today's objective is to establish that the condition exists. Jacob looked down at the document in his hands. The lines of text no longer appeared neutral. They appeared connected. There was a pause, not uncomfortable, but final. The woman closed her folder. You will receive additional materials within the next 48 hours, she said. We recommend that you review them with legal counsel. Jacob nodded slowly. I will. He stood gathering the documents without fully organizing them. For a moment, he remained there, as if expecting something more. An explanation, a resolution. But neither was offered, because neither was part of this stage. Outside the conference room, the corridor was quiet. Jacob walked through it without direction. At first, his movements automatic, his attention still anchored to the information he had just received. The structure, the sequence, the convergence. He replayed the presentation in his mind, each element aligning in ways that felt increasingly difficult to separate. For the first time, the possibility emerged, not fully formed, but present, that what he had considered control might have been something else entirely. Not taken, not removed, but redirected. Across the city, Lindsey Butler closed the corresponding file. The meeting had proceeded exactly as expected. Every point had been presented, every connection established. There had been no deviation, no need for adjustment. She placed her hand lightly on the desk, her posture unchanged, her expression steady. Because this phase had never been about confrontation. It had been about clarity. And clarity, once established, did not require reinforcement. Only progression. Behind her, the twins slept. The apartment remained quiet. And within that quiet, the system continued its movement, not outwardly, not visibly, but with the kind of precision that ensured everything that followed would not need to be argued, only acknowledged. The next phase did not begin with a courtroom. It began with a room that looked almost indistinguishable from the one before, yet carried a different kind of gravity. The lighting was softer, the tables slightly smaller, and the arrangement more deliberate. This was not a space designed to present information. It was a space designed to conclude it. Jacob Reed arrived with counsel this time. The man beside him, mid-50s, composed, efficient, had already reviewed the documents delivered over the previous 48 hours. He carried them in a structured folder, each page tabbed, each section marked for quick reference. His presence altered the tone of the room before a single word was spoken. Across the table sat Ethan Cole. He did not stand when Jacob entered, nor did he offer any gesture beyond a brief nod of acknowledgement. His posture remained steady, his hands resting lightly on the table, a single file placed in front of him. There were no introductions. They were not necessary. Everyone in the room already understood the roles being played. Jacob took his seat. For the first time since this process had begun, he did not speak first. Ethan opened the file. The motion was unhurried, controlled as though time itself had been structured around the sequence of what would follow. Mr. Reed, he began, his voice. Even this meeting is to address the conditions previously outlined and to present the formal position moving forward. Jacob's lawyer leaned slightly forward. We've reviewed the materials, he said. We'd like clarification on the scope of the claims. Ethan inclined his head. Of course. He turned the first page toward them. The document was not new, but it had changed. Where earlier versions had presented correlations, this one presented conclusions. Not speculative, not interpretive, defined. The financial activity outlined in prior documentation has been reviewed in full. Ethan continued. The sequence of transactions when considered in isolation may appear permissible. However, when aligned with shared obligations and undisclosed reallocations, they create a condition of material misrepresentation. Jacob remained still, though his attention sharpened. That's not accurate, he said. There was no intent to misrepresent anything. Ethan did not respond immediately. Instead, he allowed the statement to settle. Then, intent is not the determining factor, he said. Structure is. The same word Chloe had used. But here, it carried weight that could not be redirected. Jacob's lawyer interjected. We're not disputing that transactions occurred, he said. We're questioning the interpretation of those transactions within the broader context. Ethan nodded. Which is why the broader context has been documented. He turned to the next section. Emails appeared. Not isolated messages, threads. Conversations that extended over time, connected to specific decisions, each one reinforcing the pattern that had been established. Jacob recognized them immediately, not because of their content, but because of their placement. They had been private, unremarkable at the time. Now they were part of something else. These communications, Ethan continued, demonstrate awareness of the financial movements in question, as well as the absence of disclosure at points where disclosure was required. Jacob leaned forward slightly. They were internal discussions, he said. They don't change the nature of the transactions. Ethan's gaze remained steady. They establish alignment, he replied. The word again. Precise. Unavoidable. The room remained quiet for a moment, not tense, but settled, as though each element had found its place within a structure that no longer required explanation. Ethan moved to the final section. This brings us to the contractual position, he said. Jacob's lawyer straightened slightly. We're particularly interested in that, he said. Ethan placed a second document on the table, the contract Jacob had signed, but not the version he remembered. This one was annotated. Sections highlighted, clauses referenced, conditions connected. The agreement you entered into, Ethan, said contains provisions tied to capital origin and verification. Specifically, the introduction of funds through accounts that are subject to joint obligations without full disclosure creates a shift in control. Jacob's expression changed, subtly but undeniably. What kind of shift, he asked. Ethan turned the document toward him. Ownership adjustment, he said, effective upon confirmation of the conditions outlined. Jacob's lawyer scanned the page quickly. Are you asserting that control has already shifted? He asked. Ethan did not hesitate. Yes. The word did not echo. It did not need to. It remained where it was placed, fully formed, requiring no reinforcement. Jacob sat back. For the first time, the structure he had been trying to interpret began to settle into something he could not reorganize. You're saying I no longer control my position, he said. Ethan met his gaze. I'm saying the position has been redefined. Jacob exhaled slowly. And Lindsey, he whisked. Where does she fit into this? There was no change in Ethan's expression. She has been part of the structure from the beginning, he said. Not emphasized, not expanded, just stated. Jacob looked down at the document again. The clauses, the conditions, the language he had not fully read. All of it aligned now in a way that left no space for reinterpretation. He nodded once, not in agreement, in recognition. His lawyer spoke again, more measured this time. What is the proposed resolution, he asked. Ethan closed the file. The resolution is outlined in the final section, he said. Asset division will proceed according to the adjusted ownership structure. Additional considerations regarding shared obligations will be addressed through formal channels. No negotiation, no escalation, just process. There was a pause, longer this time, because there was nothing left to clarify, only what remained to be accepted. Jacob stood, slowly, deliberately. He gathered the documents, though his movements lacked the certainty they had once carried. For a moment, he remained there. "Then I understand," he said. Not fully, not completely, but enough. Across the city, Lindsey Butler sat at her desk, reviewing the confirmation that the meeting had concluded. The system updated. Status changed, conditions met, everything aligned. She closed the file. Not because it was finished, but because it no longer required her attention. Behind her, the twins stirred. One of them shifted a small movement that carried more weight than anything that had just been resolved in that room. Lindsey stood, walked toward them, adjusted the blanket, her hands steady, her focus clear. Because while everything else had reached its conclusion, this was where her attention remained. Not on what had been taken, not on what had been lost, but on what had always been hers to build. And she would continue building it, without noise, without display, with the same quiet precision that had carried her to this exact point. The unraveling did not happen all at once. It rarely does. Instead, it moved through Jacob Reed's life in a sequence of small, precise shifts, each one subtle enough to be dismissed in isolation, but together forming a pattern that could no longer be ignored. The first sign appeared in his phone, a notification routine at first glance, informing him that one of his accounts had been placed under review. Not frozen, not closed, simply restricted in ways that required additional verification. He had seen similar alerts before, often tied to large transactions or changes in activity. And his initial reaction reflected that familiarity. He called the bank. The representative spoke in measured tones, referencing policy procedure and the need for documentation. There was no accusation in the conversation. No suggestion of wrongdoing, only a shift in access that required compliance. "It should be resolved within a few business days," the representative said. Jacob accepted the explanation. At that point, it still felt temporary. The second sign arrived less than 24 hours later. Another account. Different institution. Similar language. This time, the restrictions were more specific. Outgoing transfers required approval. Certain transactions were flagged automatically. Jacob felt a tightening in his chest, sharper than before, though still not fully defined. He called again. Different representative. Same tone, same structure. "Just a routine review," the voice assured him. Jacob ended the call with a brief acknowledgement, though the reassurance did not settle the unease that had begun to take shape. By the third day, the pattern was no longer abstract. Multiple accounts showed limitations. Access points shifted. Timelines extended. Each institution operated independently, yet the consistency of their actions suggested coordination. Jacob stood in the center of Chloe Davenport's living room, his phone in his hand, the sequence of notifications forming a structure he could not reorganize. "This is connected," he said, his voice lower, now less certain. Chloe looked up from the chair where she had been seated. Her posture composed, her expression unchanged. "It could be," she said. Jacob turned toward her. "It is," he replied. "This isn't random." Chloe studied him for a moment, her gaze steady, evaluating not just his words, but the shift behind them. "What exactly has changed?" she asked. Jacob exhaled slowly. "Access," he said. "Control over certain accounts." Chloe nodded. "And your documentation?" she asked. Jacob hesitated. "What about it?" Chloe's tone remained even. "Can you verify the origin and movement of every fund currently tied to your position?" The question was simple, but its implications were not. Jacob did not answer immediately. because the answer for the first time was not automatic. Later that afternoon, another message arrived. This one was not from a bank. It came through a secure, legal channel, its formatting consistent with the previous notices, but its content more direct. Notice of conditional enforcement. Jacob read the title once, then moved through the body of the message with increasing focus. The language outlined the activation of specific clauses within the contract he had signed. It referenced the same conditions discussed during the meeting: the alignment of capital origin, the verification requirements, the implications of undisclosed financial movements. But now, the tone had shifted. What had once been presented as potential had become active. The document did not suggest change. It confirmed it. Jacob placed the phone down slowly, his hand lingering on the surface of the table, as if grounding himself in something physical might restore clarity. Chloe remained where she was, watching him without interruption. "Well?" she asked. Jacob looked up. "They've activated it," he said. Chloe did not ask what it referred to. She understood. "And your position?" she asked. Jacob's expression tightened. "It's adjusted." The word felt insufficient. But it was the one he had been given. Chloe leaned back slightly, her posture shifting in a way that created distance without making it obvious. "Adjusted how?" she asked. Jacob shook his head. "I don't have the full breakdown yet." Chloe held his gaze for a moment longer. Then she looked away. The distance continued to grow in ways that did not require acknowledgement. Calls that had once been immediate became delayed. Conversations that had once been fluid became measured. Chloe's involvement did not disappear. But it changed. She asked fewer questions, offered fewer assurances. And when she spoke, her words carried less alignment and more observation. One evening, Jacob returned to find the living room empty. Not temporarily, intentionally. Chloe's belongings remained, but their arrangement had shifted. Less integrated, more contained, as if the space itself had begun to retract. Jacob moved through the room slowly, his attention catching on details that would have gone unnoticed before. A bag placed near the door, shoes no longer aligned with the rest, a jacket folded rather than draped, each one subtle, each one deliberate. His phone buzzed again. Another message. This time not formal, not structured, just a brief line from Chloe. "We should pause on external commitments until things stabilize." Jacob read it twice, then a third time. The words were careful, non-confrontational, but clear. He typed a response. "This is temporary. I'm handling it." He waited. The reply came after a delay. "I hope so, nothing more." Across the city, Lindsey Butler reviewed the same sequence from a different perspective. The system had updated in real time. Each restriction, each notification, each shift in access recorded and integrated into the broader structure she had built. There was no surprise in the data, only confirmation. She moved through the entries with the same steady focus, noting the progression, the alignment, the inevitability of the outcome. The file marked enforcement had transitioned to active status. All conditions met, all pathways engaged. She closed the file, not because it was finished, but because it no longer required oversight. The system was now operating independently, its processes designed to follow through without intervention. Behind her, the twins slept. The apartment remained quiet, its stillness uninterrupted by the shifts occurring elsewhere. Lindsey stood by the window, her gaze resting on the city, not searching for signs of change, because she did not need to see them to know they were happening. Back in Chloe's residence, Jacob sat alone at the table, the documents spread out before him, their language no longer abstract, no longer distant. He read through them again, slower this time, his attention fixed on the sections he had once overlooked. The clauses, the conditions, the structure he had entered without fully understanding. He exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible in the quiet room. For the first time, the realization settled fully into place, not as a sudden revelation, but as a complete alignment of everything he had tried to separate. He had not lost control. He had transferred it, and the system that now held it was not one he could negotiate with. Across the city, Lindsey remained still, because there was nothing left to adjust, nothing left to prepare. Only the continuation of a process that had already reached its conclusion. The rebuilding of Lindsey Butler's life did not begin with a declaration. It began with a routine. Each morning followed a structure that required no announcement, no acknowledgement, and no validation from anyone outside the walls of her apartment. The twins woke before sunrise. More often than not, their needs immediate and uncomplicated. Feeding, changing, settling them back into sleep, each task repeated with a consistency that shaped the rhythm of her days. There was no urgency in these moments, no pressure to accelerate, only presence. And in that presence, Lindsey found a clarity that required nothing from the world she had just stepped away from. Her work continued in parallel, not as an interruption to her life, but as an extension of it. The systems she had built remained active, their operations no longer dependent on constant oversight. Reports arrived at scheduled intervals, updates delivered through secure channels, each one confirming that the structure remained stable, that the assets continued to perform, that the legal frameworks held. Lindsey reviewed them when necessary, not out of obligation, out of discipline. She did not immerse herself in the details the way she had before, because the work had reached a phase where its success was no longer determined by her immediate involvement. It had been designed that way. The apartment remained unchanged, minimal, functional, deliberate. There were no additions meant to signal progress, no visible markers of the scale she now operated within. The furniture remained simple. The space uncluttered, the environment defined by intention rather than display. Visitors were rare, not because she avoided them, but because she did not require them. The few who entered did so with purpose. Ethan Cole was among them. He arrived one afternoon without ceremony, his presence as measured as ever, his attention focused not on the surroundings, but on the person within them. "They've completed the final transfers," he said, standing near the desk where Lindsey had already anticipated the update. Lindsey nodded. "I saw the confirmation." Ethan inclined his head slightly. "The remaining obligations have been resolved as well. There are no outstanding conditions." Lindsey absorbed the information without visible reaction. "Good," she said. Ethan studied her for a moment, as though assessing not the outcome, but her response to it. "There will be inquiries," he added. "Media industry, possibly individuals attempting to establish contact." Lindsey met his gaze. "They won't reach me," she said. It was not a request. It was a statement. Ethan nodded. "They won't." There was a pause. Not awkward, just complete. "Is there anything else?" Lindsey asked. Ethan considered the question. Then, "No," he said. "Everything is in place." Lindsey inclined her head once. "Then we're done." Ethan did not correct her, because in the way that mattered, they were. Across the city, Jacob Reed sat in a space that no longer felt like his. Chloe Davenport's residence remained unchanged in its physical structure, but its atmosphere had shifted in ways that did not require explanation. The conversations that once filled the rooms had diminished, replaced by a quiet that carried a different kind of weight. Chloe's presence had become intermittent. She was still there, but less so. And when she was, her attention moved elsewhere. Jacob had attempted to stabilize his position. He had made calls, scheduled meetings, sought advice from professionals who spoke in the same measured tones as those he had encountered before. But the responses followed a consistent pattern: acknowledgement, assessment, distance. No one dismissed him, but no one aligned with him either. The financial restrictions had not reversed. They had settled, defined. Accounts remained active but limited. Access remained available but controlled. The structure that had once felt flexible now felt fixed. And within that structure, Jacob's position had been reduced to something he could not expand. One evening, he found himself alone in the living room. The city visible through the glass walls, its movement continuous, indifferent. His phone lay on the table in front of him. No new messages, no new updates, only the absence of change. He picked it up, scrolled through old conversations, paused on a message he had sent weeks earlier. "We need to talk." There had been no response. Not directly, only structure, only process. He set the phone down again, because there was nothing left to initiate, nothing left to negotiate, only what remained. Back in the apartment, Lindsey sat by the window, the twins asleep behind her, the city stretching out in familiar patterns beyond the glass. She did not look for Jacob, did not think of him in terms of loss or resolution, because what had ended had done so within a system she had already moved beyond. Her attention remained where it had always been most effective, on what could be built, on what could be sustained, on what did not require explanation. She received messages, some professional, some indirect. Inquiries framed as opportunities, invitations positioned as alignment. She declined them all. Not out of disinterest, but out of clarity. Because the life she was building did not require expansion. It required stability. One afternoon, as the light shifted across the room, Lindsey sat on the floor beside the twins' cribs, her back resting lightly against the wall. Her posture relaxed in a way that did not exist anywhere else. One of the twins stirred his small hand, moving against the blanket, searching without awareness. Lindsey reached out, adjusting the fabric, her movements instinctive. The child settled. The room returned to stillness. There were no witnesses to this moment, no documentation, no structure beyond the one she had created for herself. And yet it held more certainty than anything that had unfolded in the rooms where decisions had been made, where contracts had been signed, where control had shifted. Because this was not about control. It was about continuity. Across the city, Jacob remained where he was. Not moving forward, not moving back, just present within the outcome of decisions he had made without fully understanding their trajectory. And for the first time, he did not attempt to redefine it. Back in the apartment, Lindsey stood, walked to the window, looked out at the city one more time before turning away. Not because there was nothing left to see, but because she had already seen enough. Everything that needed to end had ended. Everything that needed to continue was already in motion. And Lindsey Butler moved forward without needing to announce it. The event was not designed to be intimate. It was held in a high-ceilinged ballroom in Manhattan, the kind of space that carried quiet authority through scale alone. Glass chandeliers hung overhead, refracting soft white light across polished surfaces, while the conversations below moved in controlled currents, measured, professional, and carefully observed. It was a real estate summit, one of the few that operated without spectacle, where attendance was not advertised but understood, and where the significance of presence was measured less by visibility and more by placement. Jacob Reed had not planned to attend, at least not initially. But over the past weeks, as his position narrowed and his access became increasingly defined, invitations like this had begun to feel less like opportunities and more like reminders of where he once believed he was headed and where he now stood in relation to that trajectory. He arrived late, not deliberately, but because timing had become less predictable. He moved through the entrance with a composed expression, his posture still carrying traces of the confidence he had once relied on. The suit he wore was well-fitted, appropriate, unremarkable, in a room where nothing drew attention unless it was meant to. The conversations around him did not pause. No one turned immediately, which in itself was a kind of answer. Across the room, Lindsey Butler stood near a quiet section of the space, positioned not at the center, but within clear lines of access. Her presence did not demand attention yet. It held it subtly, without effort, in the way certain structures hold weight, without appearing to carry it. She wore a simple tailored dress in a neutral tone, her hair pulled back in a way that revealed her face without framing it for display. There were no visible markers of the scale she operated within, no excess, no embellishment, no attempt to translate authority into appearance. And yet the people who approached her did so with a recognition that required no introduction. They spoke briefly, listened carefully, moved on without lingering, because they understood that time in this context was not something to be occupied. It was something to be respected. Jacob saw her before he fully registered that he had been looking, not because she stood out in the conventional sense, but because something in the structure of the room shifted around her. He stopped, just for a moment. Not enough to draw attention, but enough to interrupt the motion he had been maintaining. She had not changed in any way that could be easily defined. Her posture remained the same, her expression unchanged, calm, observant, present. Yet the context around her had altered everything. For a moment, Jacob considered turning away, not out of avoidance, but out of recognition that whatever existed between them no longer belonged to the space he occupied. Then he moved forward, not quickly, not hesitantly, just directly. Lindsey saw him approach. She did not react immediately. She allowed the distance to close the moment to arrive without interruption, because she had already considered the possibility of this encounter, and she had already decided how it would be met. Lindsey. Jacob's voice was steady, not forced, not entirely certain, but controlled. Lindsey turned toward him. "Jacob," she said. There was no hesitation in her tone, no shift in her expression, just acknowledgement. They stood there for a moment, the space between them defined not by distance, but by everything that had already been resolved. Around them, the room continued its movement. Conversations layered over one another. Glassware clinked softly. The structure of the event remained intact. "I didn't expect to see you here," Jacob said. Lindsey inclined her head slightly. "I imagine not," she replied. There was no edge in her voice, no suggestion of irony, only clarity. Jacob nodded. "I've been following the developments," he said. "The deal, the structure." Lindsey did not ask what he meant. She knew. "It's complete," she said. Jacob exhaled slowly. "Yes," he replied. "I understand that now." There was a pause. Not uncomfortable, just measured. "I didn't realize." He began, then stopped. Not because he didn't have the words, but because he understood in that moment that the words no longer carried weight. Lindsey waited, not prompting, not assisting, just allowing the silence to define itself. "You were always part of it," Jacob said finally. It was not a question. Lindsey met his gaze. "Yes," she said. No elaboration, no explanation, because none was needed. Jacob nodded once, the movement small, contained. "I should have seen it," he said. Lindsey's expression did not change. "Seeing it wouldn't have changed it," she replied. The statement was not dismissive. It was factual. Another pause settled between them, this one longer, because it carried recognition, not of what had been lost, but of what had never been understood. Jacob looked around the room briefly, then back at Lindsey. "You've moved on," he said. It was an observation, not an accusation. Lindsey considered it. "Then I've continued," she said. The distinction was subtle, but exact. Jacob absorbed that, because within it there was no reference to him, no acknowledgement of departure, only direction. "I wanted to—" he began, then stopped again, this time not searching for words, but recognizing their absence. Lindsey did not fill the space. She did not offer closure. Because closure was not something she provided. It was something that emerged when everything else had been resolved. "It's clear," Jacob said finally. Lindsey inclined her head. "Yes," she replied. A figure approached from the side, pausing briefly near Lindsey. A man in his 50s composed familiar Ethan Cole. He did not interrupt immediately, but his presence marked a shift in the moment. Lindsey turned slightly toward him. "Ethan," she said. He nodded. "There's someone I'd like you to meet," he said. Lindsey glanced back at Jacob. Not as a dismissal, not as a final gesture, just acknowledgement of the moment as it had been. Then she turned and stepped away. Jacob remained where he was, watching her move through the room, not with distance, not with hesitation, but with the same quiet precision that had defined everything she had done. She did not look back, not because she was avoiding anything, but because there was nothing left behind that required her attention. The room continued. The event unfolded. The structure held. And Jacob stood within it, no longer trying to redefine his position, no longer attempting to reconstruct what had already been resolved. Because for the first time, he understood that what had ended between them had not ended in that hospital room. It had ended long before that. In decisions, in patterns, in structures he had entered without understanding their design. Across the room, Lindsey continued her conversation, her attention fully present, her posture unchanged. Not elevated, not altered, just aligned. And when the evening concluded, she left the same way she had arrived. Without announcement, without display. Because everything that needed to be seen had already been made visible, and everything that mattered remained exactly where she had chosen to place it. Some endings do not arrive with noise. They do not announce themselves through confrontation or demand recognition through visible resolution. Instead, they unfold through quiet alignment, through decisions made long before their consequences become visible, through actions taken without the need for validation, through a kind of clarity that does not depend on being understood by others. Lindsey Butler did not win by speaking louder. She did not reclaim anything through force. What she built in silence, through patience, through observation, through a willingness to let truth organize itself without interference. And when everything finally came into view, there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to prove. Only a life that continued forward, unchanged in its direction, uninterrupted by what had already been resolved. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to reflect on what it reveals about strength, about timing, and about the kind of justice that does not require recognition to exist. Where are you watching from right now, and what time is it there? And if you find meaning in stories where silence carries weight, where actions speak without declaration, you're welcome to stay. There are more stories like this waiting.